Hi, everyone. It's Matt. I'm the youth and family pastor at Cornerstone Church in Marshfield, and I'm here today with your Cornerstone Connection, a daily devotional. Well, we're going to jump right into the text today. We are going to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 8. So if you want to join me there, I'm going to read a few verses from that chapter and then share some thoughts and relate it back to another text in the Gospel of Luke. So here's what Paul writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. He says, "Now about food sacrificed to idols." All right. This is something that isn't really in our context or our culture, at least here in America today. Not something we really think about, but for the people that Paul is writing to in the Corinthian church, this was something that they thought about a lot. He says, "Now about food sacrificed to idols, we know that we all possess knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. The man who thinks he knows something does not yet know as he ought to know. But the man who loves God is known by God." In the following verses, what Paul is going to do is he's going to address this issue of food being sacrificed to idols, but beyond that, of is it okay or not okay to eat this food that would have been sacrificed to idols back in that day. And what Paul goes on to talk about is that there are some believers who already have the knowledge and the maturity in their walk with Christ to know that they have the freedom to eat this food. Even though it's been sacrificed to an idol, that food does nothing to defile them. Because remember what Jesus talked about. We're defiled by what's in our heart, not by what goes into our stomach. And so Paul says, yes, it's true that some of you know this. Some of you act out of this freedom, and it's okay to you to eat this food, and you're not sinning against God. But he said there are some who are believers among you, and they're new believers. And as Paul calls them in other texts, they're baby believers. They're brand new to the faith. And so for them, this idea of eating this food sacrificed to idols, this is a big no-no. It's a big sin against God. And so what Paul goes on to talk about, especially to these mature believers, is he says, okay, you may have the knowledge that this is okay, that there is freedom in Christ to do this. But I want you to not act out of that knowledge. He says, I would rather that you act out of love. I want you to have understanding for your brothers and sisters in Christ who are, quote unquote, weaker, who don't yet have that knowledge or don't yet act out of that freedom. And therefore, for them, if they were to eat that food or see you eating that food, it would cause a lot of complexity and a lot of misunderstanding and their faith in Jesus and their relationship with Him, and especially if they view it as a sin. So he says, what I want you to do, mature believers, is in circumstances like that, and eating food that has been sacrificed to idols, or let's apply it to our day. Maybe it has to do with, drinking alcohol or betting on sports or whatever it might be. Sometimes there are folks that they're believers in Christ, and to them certain things they just don't feel the freedom for that yet. They haven't learned the freedom for those things, and they don't yet, as Paul would put it, they don't yet possess that knowledge. So Paul says our job is to not act out of knowledge, but it's to act out of love. And I love what Paul says in verse 1. He says, knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. A commentator that I really enjoy, he compares it to this. He says, and I paraphrase, he says, the product of knowledge in puffing up is a bubble that like you blow with bubble gum. He said, but the product of love is a building, something that's strong and sturdy, something that's not going to eventually pop, but something that's going to stay standing and it's going to last. As I close today, friends, and I thought about what Paul says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, it brought to mind when Jesus is approached by in what's called an expert in the law in Luke chapter 10. And that expert says to Jesus and poses this question, Jesus, what is the most important law in the law of Moses? And Jesus, of course, answers that question. And this time he doesn't answer it with a question. He answers the question. And he says it's to love God. And again, I paraphrase, love God and love people. And the teacher of the law, he knew that. He believed that. And then Jesus goes on to tell the story of the Good Samaritan, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's one of those stories that in that day, in that context, and especially in talking to this expert in the law, it would have been mind-blowing. This idea that a Samaritan, somebody who was not fully Jewish, someone who the Jews would have viewed as an enemy in that time, that a Samaritan would have the love within him to go and help somebody who has been beaten and robbed and who has been left for dead, and who is actually living out this love for God and this love for people. And Jesus ends that parable and asks the expert in the law, he says, which of these three people do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus told him, go and do likewise. You see, the teacher of the law, the expert of the law, he knew the answers, right? But Jesus wanted him to not just simply act out of knowledge. He wanted him to act out of love. He wanted him to act out of love of the Good Samaritan. And that's what Paul is talking about today in 1 Corinthians chapter 8. That yes, God gives us knowledge. He gives us wisdom to apply that knowledge. But he wants us more than anything to act out of love. He wants us to consider Jesus first, others second, and ourselves last. And as we do that, we will be acting out of love rather than acting out of knowledge, which is just producing a bubble that's eventually going to burst. Friends, I hope that encourages you today, and I also hope it challenges you. And I look forward to seeing you next time on the Cornerstone Connection.